The world is a pretty intense place at the moment, and as time keeps ticking, extreme weather events, growing inequality, food scarcity, land degradation, and conflict are becoming all too common. But there's one impact of the climate crisis that no one seems to be talking about. When things are going wrong, us humans tend to get anxious. It's one of our favorite things to do. So when it comes to the breakdown and ecological collapse of the world as we know it, it's perfectly natural to find ourselves a little bit on the edge. We call this pesky feeling climate anxiety. But what does it actually mean? And what, if anything, can we do about it? For many of us, we've grown up in the midst of a climate crisis and have likely become accustomed to the doomsday headlines and scary statistics. But what are these worrying reminders doing to our mental well-being?
When you first hear about or become aware of the climate emergency, it's natural to first of all feel anxious and feel threatened because we're talking about something that is threatening to humanity and to the planet.
That's psychologist Caroline Hickman. She's been studying the effects of climate anxiety for over 10 years. Alongside a group of other leading psychologists, including Britt Ray, they conducted a survey with 10,000 young people looking into the effects of climate anxiety around the world. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the data was pretty bleak.
45% of those young people said that climate change negatively impacts their daily functioning. 75% of the young people said that the future is frightening. 59% said that humanity is doomed, which is a horribly sad statistic. And more than 50% reported each of these following emotions: sadness, anxiety, being angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty.
These overwhelming concoction of emotions are being felt by young people all around the world. And that's not surprising.
You are mentally healthy if you're worried about climate change. Paradoxically, I would worry about people who weren't worried about climate change. I think, what are you doing with your feelings? What levels of denial have you got?
Eco-anxiety can be felt by anyone who understands that their own health is tied up with the health of the environment. If it's a normal and natural response that shows that you care, it's a symptom of a society that's gone off the rails in terms of protecting planetary health.
So these feelings are a natural and normal response to the crisis we're facing. And there's more to the picture. Going back to Caroline and Britt's study, one of the most revealing findings is the data on government inaction. 65% of young people said they felt governments were failing people across the world, whilst 58% felt as though governments were betraying them and future generations. In other words, this isn't just about the fear of what lies ahead, but the disconnect between what we know is happening and the lack of action that we see from older generations, particularly those who hold the levers of power.
Children and young people over and over again have told me it's not the environmental problems that are the most distressing, it's the failure of governments, it's the failure of oil companies to act that is causing the most distress. So there's an absolute dissonance that on the one hand we know we're in a crisis, but on the other hand, we're not acting as if we're in a crisis. We're acting as if we had all the time in the world. We're talking about it being a problem whilst doing the opposite.
As if dealing with the uncertainty of the future wasn't already enough, we're being constantly gaslit by governments and large corporations who tell us not to worry, whilst at the same time, the crisis continues to worsen. They call us the snowflake generation and suggest that we're simply too sensitive. The solution? Simply watch a good old-fashioned movie and chill. Thanks, Trump. However, when it comes to fears about the degradation of our environment, this is actually nothing new. And for many communities living in the global south, the impacts of climate breakdown is already an everyday reality.
Think of indigenous peoples, for example, who have been dealing with the negative impacts of colonization coming in and disturbing their relations to the land and non-human kin, other species, natural features of the environment that they consider living.
So when we talk about climate anxiety, or when you search climate anxiety, it is mostly a white and privileged narrative that pops up. Very rarely do you see the climate trauma of the people of color, of the economically marginalized people especially. A lot of times, people don't even have the words for it because they don't realize that what they're experiencing is climate anxiety because there is no education on the climate crisis.
Those who have the least to do with causing this crisis and pumping out the emissions are paying hardest and first, often in low and middle income countries in the global south, and that those of us in high income nations are relatively privileged and protected still in comparison to our climate disaster and hazard exposure at this time.
Climate anxiety can be an all-encompassing and paralyzing feeling, made worse by the lack of action we see on the issue. For many living on the front lines of the climate crisis, this isn't an anxiety about what's coming in the future, but a grief and a sadness for what is already being lost.
It's just this fast-paced thing that feels so exhausting.
This overwhelming concoction of feelings can leave us unsure of how to move forward. Where do we go from here? How can we learn to sit with these emotions and ultimately channel them into taking action?
It starts with valuing this experience and understanding it's normal, it's healthy, it's widely shared, you're not alone. It's an act of your big-heartedness and connection to environmental identity, a sense of the world beyond just narrow human frames with other species and wild spaces. And so it's an act of compassion, and also when we're feeling the grief and love are two sides of the same coin, and you can't grieve for something that you do not love. So it's really a wonderful expression of that kind of attachment.
I feel like for a lot of us, it's easier to play it off or to make jokes about it or use comedic relief to belittle our emotions, but it's something that we have to talk about and feel because showing those emotions is so powerful because then it humanizes the climate crisis.
Instead of boxing these feelings away, we can actually use them to empower and embody our activism. And the first step to this, finding community.
Find people where you can enact your feelings, drama groups, where you can paint your feelings, where you can dance your feelings, where you can take action, grow vegetables, where you can, take care of nature, where you can get involved in rewilding projects, recycling projects, all of these things, and then campaigning.
There are now so many resources emerging around the world for doing that. Climate cafes, places like the Good Grief Network, to be able to help people reinvest the emotional energy that they're losing from being, wound up about what's going on into meaningful actions at this time.
Climate anxiety is a very real and very normal emotion with many facets. We're not just grieving our planet and worrying about the future, we're despairing at the inaction of those in positions of power. As with all emotions, we have the ability to transform the way climate anxiety works within us. Rather than send us into a hopeless spiral, we can direct its energy towards doing good. So next time you feel helpless in the face of this monumental struggle, by all means, have a scream and a cry. And then why not join a community initiative, plan a campaign, or grow some carrots? If you can find a way to turn your worries into positive actions, then they were worth it all along. The Breakdown was made possible by WaterBear, the first impact-driven streaming platform where you can watch hundreds of documentaries about the future of our planet and directly take action. It's completely free, so why not check it out?